You're watching CNN. I'm Julia Chatterley in New York. Attacks on two strategic targets in the battle for Ukraine. Take a look at these satellite images. They show the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, known as the Moskva. It's been damaged and its crew evacuated. Now, Russian state media says a fire broke out. It remains afloat and is moving to port. The Ukrainians, however, are taking credit. They say it was targeted by their anti-ship missiles. And 800 kilometers north in the Kharkiv region, these images released by the Ukrainian government reportedly show a bridge that was blown up as Russian military vehicles were crossing. The Ukrainians say armored cars and trucks were destroyed in the attack. CNN has not been able to verify the claims. Now, with more on the Russian warship, CNN correspondent Matt Rivers sent this report from Lviv.
Well, no matter which way you slice this, Julia, the fact that one of Russia's premier warships is now out of action is a very significant development, no matter who you believe when it comes to the cause of the fire on board. What we're hearing from Russian state media is that a fire broke out on board this ship. They don't say what the cause of the fire was, but that caused ammunition on board the ship to explode. It put the ship out of action, and it forced the Russian Navy to evacuate all of the sailors that were on board that ship. They've since been evacuated, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, to other ships in the area. This ship now being set to be towed to port, presumably to make some repairs. Now, on the Ukrainian side, they're saying that it was Ukrainian armed forces that caused this by firing shore-based cruise missiles that hit this ship. It caused the fire. It caused all of that ammunition to explode and essentially knocked this ship out of action. They said it began to sink at some point after the missiles hit that ship. The Ukrainians saying that they used a missile system called the Neptune missile that they have developed themselves here in Ukraine. It was a missile first brought online within the last year or so, according to Ukrainian officials. Now, CNN cannot independently verify the status of this ship. Normally, we would rely on satellite imagery to be able to get a look at this ship, confirm whether it was hit or not, but right now there is cloud cover in that area, which has made getting any satellite imagery to analyze difficult at this point. But no matter what the cause of this is, I think it's a very significant development. Both technically, it impacts the Russian Navy's ability to operate. This is one of their premier warships, but this is also a symbolic blow, I think, to the Russian Navy. This is the flagship of the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet. The fact that it is no longer operational, Julia, is a big deal.
And more from the port city of Mariupol. Russian state TV has aired video it claims shows Ukrainian prisoners of war. Some of them appear to be injured and on stretchers. On Wednesday, Ukraine said one unit of its troops in the city had joined forces with another battalion. Again, CNN not in Mariupol and is not embedded with any Russian troops there, so we've been unable to verify the Russian version so far. And a large-scale offensive could be launched in Donbass over the next few days. That's according to intelligence from the French military. The Kremlin's warning that if Ukrainian attacks on what they consider Russian territory continue, then they will strike so-called decision-making centres, including Kyiv. Now, many people in the region remain defiant and say they're not leaving, as Ben Weidman reports.
All is not quiet on Ukraine's eastern front. Not far from the town of Barvinkove, Russian mortars warn of what's to come. Ukrainian officials say the offensive in the Donbass region, the eastern part of Ukraine, has begun. Perhaps it has. Or perhaps this is the softening up before the onslaught. Among Ukrainian troops, bravado.
We're stronger than this.
This officer gives a more sober assessment. The Russians are building up for an attack. They're coming and coming and coming, Lieutenant Leonid tells me. We're not in an easy situation. Russian shelling Tuesday killed 3 people, including a 16-year-old girl, according to the town mayor, who has been urging residents to leave. Not everyone heeds his call. The stubborn few wait for supplies. This is our town, insists Galina. We're staying here. We know our soldiers are protecting us. Lyudmila looks to a higher power. We'll pray to God, she says. Maybe he will save us all. 83-year-old Yelizaveta sits outside her home. She too is staying put. My son's wife is scared and will probably leave today, she says, but I'm not afraid. And then off she goes on her bicycle, gathering storm, be damned. Ben Wiedemann, CNN, Barvinkovy, Eastern Ukraine.
Vladimir Putin appearing defiant on Russian energy exports. The president says there's no alternative to Russian gas and is threatening to take his business to Asia if Europe doesn't cooperate. Claire Sebastian following the story for us. Claire, the lack of sanctions on oil and gas from Europe in particular is evidence that his point on the inability to move away from Russian gas is quite right. And that's what's heartbreaking about this, I think. What did he have to say about the Asia pivot?
Yeah, so Putin is meeting with various different sectors of his economy, Julia, to sort of prepare them for the fact that, as he says, sanctions are going to be in place for a long time. So he says the Russian economy needs to adapt. And he set out various tasks for the energy sector in Russia to sort of secure it for the long term. And one of those is finding new or developing sort of eastern and southern markets for its energy. Take a listen to what he had to say.
We need to diversify our exports. We need to assume that in the foreseeable future, deliveries of energy in the western direction will be reduced. So we need to strengthen the tendency of the last few years, step by step reorientate our exports to the fast-growing markets of the south and east.
So the upshot of that is he's saying, look, the West needs us more than we need the West. We have alternatives. And Julia, we are seeing this happening already. Analysts are saying that India, for example, is purchasing a lot more oil since the war started from Russia than it was before. So they are finding alternatives, especially since they are now having to sell Russian oil at a discount, which was not surprisingly not something that he mentioned.
No. I'm sure he didn't. And in the interim, he's saying to the Europeans and those so-called unfriendly nations, you need to pay for your oil and your gas in rubles, except we spoke to the French finance minister in the past week and he said, nothing's changed. We're still paying as per contract. Also not mentioned, Claire.
Yeah, well, this is becoming an increasingly complex situation, Julia, because we're hearing from the likes of the French, the Netherlands saying today that they are not going to pay for gas in rubles. The European Commission president saying to CNN also that this would be a violation of sanctions. We also heard from Vladimir Putin today that he says they're seeing delays in payments through Western banks, that payment failures are happening. All of this is looking a little bit worrying. The delays in payments, the refusal by the EU or certain EU countries to pay in rubles, Russia's rhetoric that it has a lot of access to alternative markets and it's going to develop that. I think that spells that we're in a very complex moment in terms of Russian gas supplies to Europe, even as we wait for any more talk among European leaders on whether they will move towards an embargo on oil and potentially discuss something on gas, even though it's very clear that, as Putin said, they don't have an alternative.
Yes, for now. Claire Sebastian, thank you for that. Rising energy prices, of course, financing risks and food insecurity, the triple threat facing some of the world's poorest nations and more, according to a joint statement from the World Bank, the IMF, the World Food Programme and the World Trade Organization, who are making a collective call to action. David Mackenzie joins us to discuss. David, Oxfam caught my attention this week ahead of the IMF spring meetings next week, saying 860 million people could be living in extreme poverty on less than $1.90 a day by the end of this year. The number of undernourished people could reach 827 million in 2022. The number of people that are facing severe difficulties as a result of what we're seeing and beyond, it's huge.
Well, it is huge, and there's always this issue of hunger, of course, on this planet because of the inequalities that countries have to deal with every single day. But I know on your show you've been talking a lot about inflation and food inflation, and on top of that, the war in Ukraine could bring higher prices and more pain. The early starts and the intense work at the Phillips Atakele bakery in Lagos used to be worth it, used to be profitable.
Since early this year, precisely around the time of the bombing of Ukraine, which has affected the supply of yeast, which has affected our primary item of our production, which is the white wheat flour. Our flour has been very expensive. The prices are changing constantly.
Now they can only afford to produce half of what they did, and each tin gets less dough. This war is horrifying for Ukraine's people. It could be devastating for global food security. Russia and Ukraine are agricultural export powerhouses. On the field of battle, farmers will struggle to plant crops. With export ports blockaded by Russian warships, it has pushed the prices even higher. So the 10 hours Mariam Arigoke spends selling bread won't be enough to feed her 2 children. She says customers don't have the cash anymore. They often refuse to pay the going rate. And even on the fertile slopes of Mount Kenya, they are hurting. Caroline Kimarua had to slash her workforce. The cost of fertilizer for her tea and coffee plantations has doubled in recent months.
You have no money to buy that fertilizer at that high cost.
And Russia is one of the world's biggest fertilizer producers. Sanctions and trade disruptions are likely to push prices even higher. Could this be any worse timed?
The war is starting at one of the worst times because we were already thinking we are in a recovery mode. On top of that, there were already inflation pressures that were across the world. Africans are spending a lot on fuel and spending a lot on food. Then in these current moment, this is a tough time for the continent.
The impact of this conflict is coming on top of already soaring global grain prices. And if you look at this map over here, of course, countries across the world could feel the pain, but economists point to specific African countries like Senegal, which imports more than 50% of its wheat from Ukraine and Russia, and Somalia, which imports more than 90%. And in Somalia, already suffering from generational drought, hundreds of thousands of children, like 7-month-old Arden, are hollowed out by hunger and sickness. If the rains fail again, the war in Europe could push this crisis into a catastrophe, even into famine. Aid agencies depend heavily on grain from Ukraine. All of these countries have very complex reasons for this food insecurity. It's not, of course, just because of the conflict in Ukraine. But, Julia, the issue here really is that on top of the pain already being felt, whether it's by drought and climate change in Somalia or in Nigeria's case, governance issues and inflationary pressure, it's just piling on more pain onto these already high prices. Now, that excellent economist told me that the next few months will be key. It might not be a case of food shortages per se. There should be enough food around to be distributed, but the price will be such that many more people, millions potentially around the world, won't be able to afford that food. And he really did stress the issue of fertilizer costs. If sanctions and trade complications on the Russian side don't get fertilizer out, it could take time for countries like the US, China, and Canada to fill that gap. And normally what happens is if there's a lack of food supply, prices go up and producers expand. But if the inputs for that production, in this case fertilizer, are sky high, they may not do that. So in the months ahead, particularly if this conflict draws on for many months, you could see a very serious consequence in food prices and food security, not just in the African context, but in the Middle East, Central Asia, and even Latin America. Julia?
Yeah, and what other producer nations must not do is hoard, whether it's grain or fertilizers too, which is a conversation that we've also had with the World Food Programme recently as well, and the World Bank. David Mackenzie, thank you for that report, vitally important. Okay, straight ahead. Russia's new threat as Finland and Sweden consider joining NATO. The former Finnish Prime Minister Alexander Stubb gives his take next. Welcome back. Russia warning it will bolster its defences in the Baltic region, including deploying nuclear weapons if Sweden and Finland join NATO. Finland, which shares a long border with Russia, and Sweden are considering joining the alliance as the war in Ukraine drastically increased concerns about security. Their leaders say decisions on whether to apply could be made in a matter of weeks. Former Finnish Prime Minister Alexander Stubb joins us now. Alex, great to have you on the show. Threats have been made many times in Finland's direction, but perhaps never more potent. How concerned are you by the threat?
Well, not very concerned. I think, we have a very resilient society, and what we're expecting when we file the NATO application within a few weeks are three forms of threat. One are these sort of verbal or information threats, two are hybrid threats, and three are cyber threats. And I think all three will be very prevalent during this so-called grey period from when we apply to when we become members.
Let's talk about the grey period, because this is important. You have this moment when the nation applies to be a NATO member, and then the point upon which they become a NATO member. And as you refer to it, a grey period. Surely there has to be security guarantees made in that interim period so that the message is we may not yet be a NATO member, but we're protected.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things that we've kept in mind throughout. The first one is, of course, that we have a very strong standing military, 900,000 reserves and 280,000 that can be mobilized within a matter of days, including a very strong air force, land and sea force. Then the second one is that our political leadership has, during the past few months, basically been engaged in diplomatic conversations and getting what I call implicit security guarantees from the likes of the United States, the United Kingdom, probably France, and of course NATO itself. So I think we're pretty well covered. And also it's very important that our political leadership communicates to the general public that there are going to be these kinds of threats. We saw one of them actually last Friday when the homepages of the Finnish Foreign Ministry and Defense Ministry were down when Zelensky was speaking to the Finnish Parliament.
Talk about the implicit security guarantees. Do you trust those in light of what we've seen with Ukraine?
Yeah, definitely. And there are many reasons for it. I mean, we have a lot of good bilateral agreements. For instance, with Sweden, we participate in JEF together with the United Kingdom, and I'm sure that the United States will help out if need be. I think it's more about providing material, if anything were to happen that would, threaten our security. But to be honest, I don't think that's going to happen. The Russians can't be basically fighting on two fronts. So we have to understand that in a war where the Russian military actually seems quite weak, they can't be multitasking down in Ukraine and up in northeastern Europe.
It's a valid point. You also mentioned the relative size of your military to population is pretty significant, let's be clear. But you're also mentioning on the other hand, cyber attacks, and the fact that actually you faced cyber attacks in Finland last week as a result of President Zelensky speaking to Parliament. Is the country prepared, protected against the risk of cyber attacks, particularly if they escalate?
Well, as far as we obviously can. I mean, I don't have the latest intelligence, but I remember when I was in office, I was quite impressed with the types of defense mechanisms that we're able to do, because the basic thinking, I think, of our military is that everything in today's world can be weaponized. So we talk about this sort of age of unpeace. And that means that you can use energy as a weapon. You can use human shields, sending asylum seekers across the border as a weapon. And then, of course, you can do cyber attacks and send out malware. And the key there is to be resilient, to understand where they're coming from, and be prepared to change tack when necessary. And, never underestimate the capacity of the Finnish authorities to stay cool, calm, and collected in the face of adversity. You kind of have to have that mentality when you have 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia.
Yeah, you grow that, I think, over time, to your point. You've been fighting for NATO membership for, the best part of 3 decades. And, I remember a conversation with you many years ago where you'd all but given up hope. The pendulum swing in public opinion has been so dramatic as a result of what we've seen in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. I mean, we're talking about it like it's a done deal. Is it a done deal? And do you think there's anything that could perhaps swing that pendulum back? A threat, perhaps?
Yeah, I guess the first observation is that. Yeah, I guess the first observation is to say that you just almost revealed my age, that I've been in favor of NATO membership for most of my adult life. So that makes it 3 decades. And you're absolutely right. You know, I mean, I did sort of lose hope at some stage, say around, you know, the early 2010s. I thought, you know, this is a done deal. We're never going to go in. But things happened very quickly. I do think it's a done deal. I'm convinced that Finland will file an application within a few weeks, latest May, and by the end of this year, we will be members. And the shift is based on what I call rational fear. So our NATO membership was basically decided on the 24th of February when Russia and Putin attacked Ukraine. And remember that Finns are very capable of doing big security political changes in the time and linchpin of history. We declared independence in 1917 in the middle of the Bolshevik Revolution. We accepted peace in 1944 from Stalin by losing territory, where, by the way, my grandparents and my dad were born. And then when the Cold War ended, we immediately became EU members. And now we're doing the same with NATO. And for us, it's very rational, it's very calm, and the train has left the station and we're on the way to NATO headquarters.
Even if peace were declared, it wouldn't change anything?
Oh, no, it wouldn't change, because we have to understand that we are in a semi-permanent state of affairs with a divided Europe. On one side of the new Iron Curtain, we have an authoritarian, totalitarian, aggressive, imperialistic, and revisionist Russia. And on the other side of the curtain, we have roughly 35 democracies, countries that want to cooperate, abide by international law, and believe in freedom and the values of liberal democracy. So this is going to be a permanent state of affairs. We have to maximize our security, and we do that by having a strong independent defense and by joining NATO, regardless of whether there is peace or not.
Makes sense to me. One more question. President Putin said today that Europe has no choice, no alternative to Russian gas and oil. And I mentioned that that's evidence in the lack of oil and gas sanctions that we've seen so far from Europe. Do you see that Germany and nations like it that are so hugely reliant on Russian energy stand in the way of perhaps ending this war and preventing the kind of sanctions that could have a true and material impact on the Russian economy?
The answer is a double no. The first no goes to Putin. I think he's been poorly briefed. Yes, we are dependent on Russian energy, but we can also shift that with time. The second no is to say that no matter how big the onslaught of sanctions, that is not going to be the make or break. It's just part and parcel of a holistic approach of how we can end the war. So I do not think that Germany stands in the way, and what we're seeing now is a waning away from Russian gas and oil. Remember, these two are going to be stranded assets in any case within 1 or 2 decades. So the inevitable is just going to happen faster than we expected.
Alexander Stubb, former Finnish Prime Minister, said, thank you so much, and a beautiful apartment behind you, I have to say. In happier times, you would have talked about those books. Talk to you soon. Thank you, sir.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Coming up. Thousands of people in southeastern Ukraine rely on this company for their very survival. How a family-owned grain firm struggles to keep the flour flowing and to keep feeding civilians and the Ukrainian troops. Next. Welcome back. The US is working to assess the damage done to the flagship of the Russians' Navy Black Sea Fleet. The Pentagon believes there was an explosion on board the Moskva yesterday. Ukraine says it hit the vessel with missiles. Russia says the damage came from an onboard fire. The US says the ship is still seaworthy and making its way across the Black Sea. Russia claims all crew members were evacuated. The IMF, World Bank and other organisations are demanding coordinated global action to ensure that the most vulnerable nations get the food they need as the Ukraine war drags on. Ukraine and Russia grow more than a quarter of the world's wheat, but supply disruptions are already pushing prices to multi-year highs. Wheat currently off the recent highs hit in early March, but still up by more than 70% over the past year. Prices for corn and soybeans are also, as you can see, up significantly. Now, rising prices would typically translate into higher profits for farmers and other food suppliers, but the rising costs of fuel and fertilizers they use are also cutting into margins. And Ukrainian farmers, well, they're dealing with tragedy too, a shooting war taking place on the very land upon which they earn their living. Granaries have been destroyed, and many of the people who work in the food industry there have left their jobs to fight. Shamil Malachiev joins us now. He's the co-owner of one of the largest grain mills in southern Ukraine, which delivers flour, pasta and baked goods across the war-torn region. Shamil, great to have you on the show. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time, because I know you are incredibly busy. Talk me through this, because if you don't go to work, then people don't get fed, and that includes Ukraine's military too.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for introduction. It's great to be here. It's great to be able to, shine a little bit of light onto the current situation in Ukraine, how it is for entrepreneurs and business owners. Since the start of the war, today is the 50th day, actually, and we've been adapting. I can't call it any other way. It's been 50 days of constant adaptation. Looking at where the military action is taking place and looking at what best can you do to make sure that you continue providing people with food, you continue providing military armies with food to make sure that they can protect, our part of Ukraine. As you might know, we are located currently in the south of Ukraine, in the city of Mykolaiv, and currently, this is one of the three main points of fighting for the Russians. This is where they try to, control the Kherson region.
Yes.
And now we are preparing for quite a long defensive, positioning from Mykolaiv region. So everybody, like every person living in Mykolaiv, is doing their best to make sure they can do something to help.
Explain what that means, because I believe over a third of your workers either fled to safer areas. To your point, you're in a very dangerous place where there is and has been intense fighting. That means the workers that remain are working harder. I know you're having to pay them more because they're frightened. People surely are frightened to go into work every day. You must be frightened. How does that work, and how often are they having to go to bomb shelters?
Since the start, the scariest moment was probably the first couple of days. This is when it was the first time at 5 a.m. when we started hearing, shells dropping off all over Ukraine and Mykolaiv region as well. Everybody was panicking, trying to figure out what to do. Some of our workers have moved away from the city itself to the villages that are in Mykolaiv region. Some try to go further away to the western part of Ukraine. And obviously some people are trying their best to work remotely, which we appreciate. But most of the people who actually have to deal with production, operate the lines, the machinery, I'm really thankful to all of them for staying, for showing their support, showing their incredible leadership characteristics, like the potential. They're showing the best in themselves. We get bombings. We don't know when they're going to happen. Usually some of them happen from around 9 till 12, and then another round starts at around 6 till 8 in the evening. Obviously, it's not timed, so something can happen in between. But all of our employees, every morning, we have a common chat for the whole group. And once we see that there are no sirens, there haven't been any shellings like currently, we're calling everyone to come to the factory and to continue producing food. Obviously, for most of the employees, we had to double the salaries that they're getting, because we understand how much stress and how much risk they're going through on the journey to work every day. And this is the minimum we can do to show our support and our appreciation for their work, because they're doing fantastic things. They're producing so much wheat flour and pasta and cookies, and every day we are giving away as humanitarian need. Every day we are feeding people. We are cooperating with restaurants who've pivoted all of their businesses towards feeding, towards doing what they can to volunteer to provide the food for those in need. So we're supplying them with wheat flour, and they are then baking bread, buns, and supplying them to people in need all around the place. Literally 70% of all citizens of the Mykolaiv region, they started, volunteering, doing whatever they can to do something, at least something. It's a kind of a mission, a calling that all of us feel inside, to protect our motherland, to help each other. We really started feeling that in unity, we get the strength to carry on.
The community spirit is such a beacon of light in such dark times. I know that 60% or around 60% of what you're producing is going to the military too. I think one of the big concerns that people have is, how are your farmers operating? How are they going to harvest? How are they going to replant for next year? What kind of reserves and supplies do you have? And even once you've produced what you're producing, do you have the ability to get it out to people that aren't perhaps just in the local area, to transport it? Can you give me a sense of all of those things? And I appreciate there were a lot of questions there.
Yeah. Well, first of all, with the logistics, ever since the war started, we've had literally 70% of the directions on which we can ship our goods closed down, and the bridges were exploded. Some of the directions were taken over by Russian forces. So pretty much the only direction we can now take is towards Odessa. So if you look at who we are supplying at the moment, 70% of them are new customers. There are customers around the Mykolaiv region who we didn't work with before. They used to work with other suppliers, but now with the logistics problems coming into place, with the town being half closed, they have to rely on our supply for our help to function. With the military orders coming to place, this is something that we've never worked with, never encountered, and I really hope the rest of the planet never has to encounter with anything like this, where you have to feed a large number of military, because there is some dangers of attack. But we've increased our production capacity nearly by 50% to make sure that we can account for the army, for the humanitarian aid, and also for the distribution that goes towards Mykolaiv shops, that goes towards Odessa shops, and to the Western Ukraine. Because at the moment, a lot of large volunteering organizations, they have to feed all the refugees, because we have not only the refugees that fled outside of Ukraine, but also people who have shifted within the Ukraine as well. And the demand for the basic products is increased in the western part of Ukraine. So we're trying our best to make sure that... Yeah.
I understand. Who's paying for this? Are you losing money? I know it's not about the money, but you have to remain viable financially to be able to keep doing this. Are you being paid for this and supported financially?
With the distribution, with the current working with supermarkets and shops, we're getting paid. Obviously, we cut down our profit margin to the minimum. With the army, we are supplying at the prime cost. And our prime cost has increased a little bit, because in wheat flour business, you have the grain, you have 20%, which is bran, which is usually exported. But now with Odessa being closed, we can't export that brand. So it puts, another pressure on the prime cost as well, as well as the salaries, for example. And the remaining humanitarian aid is something that we've been doing for 2.5 weeks out of our own pocket. And then when we realized that, it's around $8,000 every day that you're giving out to all the volunteering organization, we've started fundraising bit by bit. And 2.5 weeks ago, we even received a $50,000 donation from the Nova Ukraine Fund from the Silicon Valley. So that's a huge help from the US. And now we're doing our best to fundraise to make sure that we have enough strength to continuing to support humanitarian needs, because we see all these people, we see the smiles, we see all the people who are getting the food, and in the wartime you only think about how much good can I do. Once this is over, we'll be able to rebuild, we'll make up for all of the lost potential, we'll try to build a new country and a better organization.
I believe you. You're warriors, you're keeping people alive. One thing that occurred to me, Shamil, and I think it goes to, you can explain how you're managing to keep morale up among your workers in dangerous times, is we were just showing the video of your plant, and it looks like any kind of big infrastructure, and given how critical you are to feeding troops, you mentioned the danger of supplying Ukrainian forces. Are you worried that you could become a target for Russian attacks? And what do you tell your workers who might be afraid of that too?
We're scared of that daily, really. Yeah. Every night we check the messages, we check the security people to make sure that the plant is safe. Whenever we hear explosions, every day we're just hoping that nothing happens to the factory, that we can continue going to work. Your psychology, it works in a little bit different way during the war. So during the peaceful time, you would be able to kind of assess everything with a cold mind and say, okay, it might be risky. But during the wartime, you kind of, all of this goes in the background, and what you have to do, and you just do that nonetheless. And whenever we hear sirens at the workplace, we just go to the bunkers and wait for an hour and a half, depending on how long it might take. And then we come back and continue working. We're trying to do our best to provide security to the people. And each one of our workers, it's the culture of the company. They know what they're doing. They know how important their role is into making sure that, all of the people have enough food to continue fighting, to feel well. And during the wartime, I think it's quite healthy for your psychology, psyche, to be busy with work, and to make sure that you're doing something useful. And inside you're feeling, I'm contributing. I'm not just sitting in one place. And it kind of takes your mind away from the worries of when you're sitting at home while the sirens. This is the worst. This is where you have no certainty of what's going to happen. But whilst you're at work, all these thoughts kind of go away, and you're just concentrating on being productive. And it's no time for quarrels or anything like that. We work together as a team, as one unit. And all of this stuff, they are my heroes, really. Each and every single worker, every single volunteer. I'm shocked and I'm surprised and pleasantly surprised by how everybody's transformed and how much they're doing. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, this war is creating many heroes. You literally said exactly what I was thinking. Thank you for what you're doing and for what your team are doing and for your bravery in the face of such challenges. We'll stay in touch. Stay safe, please. And thank you. The co-owner of the family-run wheat and grain mill and bakery in Mykolaiv, Ukraine. Thank you, Shamil. We're back after this. Welcome back. Let me bring you up to speed with some of the other stories making headlines around the world. In Shanghai, COVID infections hitting a new high, more than 27,000 in a single day. Most of the city remains under a strict lockdown, and surrounding regions are imposing restrictions too. At least 44 cities across China now under some sort of lockdown. CNN's David Culver is with us from Shanghai. David, you and I were talking about this yesterday, and I'm sure many of our viewers will have seen quite frightening video on social media of a man being removed from his apartment. We're not showing it because we haven't verified it, but these kind of stories and images do spread fear. Is there any sign that this is coming to any kind of end, or lessening at least?
You know, in rhetoric, you hear what they say, and they're trying to ease these lockdowns and these restrictions, Julia. But certainly, they're continuing to go forward. I mean, we're living in the midst of one right now. And so the restrictions are still very much in place. And I think that's why it's so concerning, and you pointed it out there, that Shanghai has set another record high in the daily COVID case count as it's battling this Omicron-fueled surge. And the severe lockdowns, they're continuing for most of the 25 million people living in this metropolis. You've got residents still battling to try to get access to basic necessities, talking food and medicine. And the panic and uncertainty is also growing. It's spread well beyond Shanghai. You mentioned those 44 other Chinese cities, likewise under either full or partial lockdown, so as to keep in line with Beijing's zero COVID policy. Now, many of these are along China's coast, and so that's impacting major ports, it's affecting shipping, that in turn adding to the global supply chain issues. And for example, in neighboring Suzhou City, you've got officials there urging their 12.7 million residents stay at home, stop all unnecessary movements. Folks then turning to trying to stock up as quickly as possible after they saw the horror stories from Shanghai. Residents there rushing to supermarkets, shelves quickly emptied. Similar scenes playing out in the south, Guangzhou, where the city of more than 15 million is undergoing a third round of citywide mass testing. And then you've got two cities in northeastern Jilin province, Changchun and Jilin City. This is an industrial hub. They remain hotspots, despite lockdown measures there having been in place, get this, for more than a month. Changchun has quarantined, by the way, more than 200,000 people since the start of this most recent outbreak. Now back here in Shanghai, as COVID cases are continuing to rise, the recent anger, the frustrations, the fatigue, Julia, that you and I have been talking about, well, that now has police warning that anyone violating lockdown orders would be punished in strict accordance with the law. And so that kind of goes to that video you're referencing there that police are trying to deter.
Yeah, I mean, in the West now, the horror of COVID, by and large, is gone. It feels like the pain and horror of COVID is being amplified by the measures that we continue to see in China, as you yourself have experienced.
I think you're right.
Yeah, David Culver in Shanghai for us there. Thank you, as always. We're back after this. Welcome back. Call it a day on global markets fit for a tweet. I'll explain. US and European stocks mixed as investors get mostly encouraging earnings news from banking giants Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley and Citigroup. The numbers helping offset a cautious assessment of the US economy yesterday from the head of JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon. Today's main event for investors coming a few hours ago, however, Elon Musk announcing a more than $43 billion bid to buy up the rest of the Twitter shares that he does not yet own, and then take the company private. Where have I heard that before? Musk calls the more than $54 a share offer his best and final bid. Musk is already Twitter's largest shareholder, owning more than 9% of the firm, but shares are not getting much of a bounce. Lots of questions about this offer. Anna Stewart joins me now. Anna, our collective heads, I think, exploded when this came through. And the share price was higher a lot earlier, but as people have continued to ask questions and wonder whether he's really means it or whether he's joking or whether he's got the money, so the steam has come out of that share price. What do we know and what don't we? That's going to take you longer.
It really will. I mean, given it's an Elon Musk story, thankfully we're not short on Elon Musk's thoughts on all of this, even within the SEC filing, which makes very clear that he can withdraw this proposal at any time. And attached to the filing was actually a voice transcript from Elon Musk saying, and I will bring you the first bit, "I am not playing the back and forth game. I have moved straight to the end. It is a high price and your shareholders will love it." It is a high price, but actually some analysts I'm speaking to today do question it, pointing to the fact that, of course, Twitter shares were around $70 around a year ago. I'll bring you a little bit more of it, though. He then goes on to say, "If the deal doesn't work, and I would need to reconsider my position as a shareholder. This is not a threat. It's simply not a good investment without the changes that need to be made." So that big stake that he has built up of over 9%, worth nearly $3 billion, that could effectively be dumped back onto the market. And one analyst I spoke to, Neil Campling from Mirabaud Equity Research, questions whether it's all a big publicity stunt. He says the price, particularly the $4.20 at the end of $54.20, is a clear reference to when Musk said he would buy out Tesla for $420 a share. And 420, of course, the date of Cannabis Day in the US. So call it conspiracy theory, call it all madness. What a story that has gripped the markets. Looking at that share price, I think investors are questioning this as well.
Yeah, and I saw one person, many have since subsequently asked, is he playing? Of course he's playing. He's always playing. That's the 420 playfulness. The question is, will he follow through if he can get the financing? And do Twitter and the board at Twitter, I mean, it's tough to argue with this. 54% premium on where it was trading yesterday. If he's got the money, surely you have to sell, Anna.
Yeah, and if they don't accept this, well, do they then have to sell to someone else? I mean, that's certainly one suggestion we've had. And of course, what does this mean for freedom of speech for Twitter? If they say no to this, is it based on where Elon Musk would take the company? Can you have a billionaire as adversarial and provocative as Elon Musk taking control of Twitter, a platform he has used to troll all sorts of people, including, of course, the Canadian Prime Minister, who he compared to Adolf Hitler? He has got into SEC trouble. He's been fined tens of millions of dollars for misleading investors on Twitter. Is this the man that should be taking over? That is a big question for shareholders, for the board, also for regulators, and frankly, the users of Twitter.
Yes. Show me the money, then call me the regulators, and then we'll all, in the interim, just go and lie down in a darkened room and wait. Anna Stewart, thank you for that. Okay, and finally, one man in Ukraine is thanking rescuers after this sweet reunion. Police say the 77-year-old miraculously survived a Russian attack in the Donetsk region that reduced his home to rubble. Then, another miracle. His dog was pulled from the wreckage alive.
Спасибо хлопчикам, що швидко, оперативно все зробили тут, все підключали. Спасибо їм, велике спасибо.
Oh, police say the man and the puppy were given medical care and are both doing well. Yay. That's it for the show. Stay with CNN. Connect the World with Becky Anderson is up next.
I'm Becky Anderson, coming to you live from London. Hello and welcome to the show. You're watching Connect the World. And today on the show, an interview with the Foreign Minister of Finland as that country considers membership in NATO. And I'll speak to the Director General of the World Trade Organization about the impact that Russia's war on Ukraine is having on trade around the world. Plus, next hour, we'll go live to also at CNN.com and on the CNN app. Well, ahead on this show, Connect the World, the World Trade Organization forecasts a gloomy outlook for international trade. We'll be speaking with the Director General about the uncertainty caused by war and where Russia's place is now in global trade. Well, the ripple effects of Russia's war on Ukraine prompting major global organizations to call for urgent, coordinated action on food security. Heads of the World Bank Group, the International Monetary Fund, the World Food Programme and the World Trade Organization signed a joint statement in which they warn that households are under more and more pressure due to supply shortages and higher prices for food staples. And for food producers, the soaring prices of fertilizer and natural gas needed to make that fertilizer are making business in many places unsustainable. David McKenzie with this report.
The early starts and the intense work at the Phillips Atakele bakery in Lagos used to be worth it, used to be profitable.
Since early this year, precisely around the time of the bombing of Ukraine, which has affected the supply of yeast, which has affected our primary item of our production, which is the white wheat flour. Our flour has been very expensive. The prices are changing constantly.
Now they can only afford to produce half of what they did, and each tin gets less dough. This war is horrifying for Ukraine's people. It could be devastating for global food security. Russia and Ukraine are agricultural export powerhouses. On the field of battle, farmers will struggle to plant crops. With export ports blockaded by Russian warships, it has pushed the prices even higher. So the 10 hours Mariam Adegoke spends selling bread won't be enough to feed her 2 children. She says customers don't have the cash anymore. They often refuse to pay the going rate. And even on the fertile slopes of Mount Kenya, they are hurting. Caroline Kimarua had to slash her workforce. The cost of fertilizer for her tea and coffee plantations has doubled in recent months.
You have no money to buy that fertilizer at that high cost.
And Russia is one of the world's biggest fertilizer producers. Sanctions and trade disruptions are likely to push prices even higher. Could this be any worse timed?
The war is starting at one of the worst times because we were already thinking we are in a recovery mode. On top of that, there were already inflation pressures that were across the world. Africans are spending a lot on fuel and spending a lot on food. Then in these current moment, this is a tough time for the continent.
The impact of this conflict is coming on top of already soaring global grain prices. And if you look at this map over here, of course, countries across the world could feel the pain, but economists point to specific African countries like Senegal, which imports more than 50% of its wheat from Ukraine and Russia, and Somalia, which imports more than 90%. And in Somalia, already suffering from generational drought, hundreds of thousands of children, like 7-month-old Arden, are hollowed out by hunger and sickness. If the rains fail again, the war in Europe could push this crisis into a catastrophe, even into famine. Aid agencies depend heavily on grain from Ukraine. David Mackenzie, CNN London.
Well, as David showed us, the soaring cost of basic goods, yeast, wheat, oil, fertilizer, is adding to this food crisis. These prices have spiked, and they have led the World Trade Organization to slash its global forecast for the year. As you can see from this chart, the predicted growth this year of international trade at nearly 5% before the war. That's been cut now to just 3%, as expected, the war in Ukraine affecting people far beyond its borders. Well, the WTO Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, has reiterated the warning that the impact will be felt most by those who are already struggling. She says particularly in low-income families and countries where food accounts for a large fraction of household spending. I'm delighted the Director General of the World Trade Organization joins me now live. A most important report at what is such an important time. You heard David's report there speaking specifically to Africa. I'm normally based in the Gulf and the wider Middle East, and we know the story around the Middle East and North Africa is a really, really tough one as well. You've called for urgent action in relation to this food crisis. What does your appeal mean in practice, Ngozi? What practical steps are you calling for from governments and private companies, many of whom, and I'm thinking oil and gas here, are making significant money out of this crisis?
Well, thank you, Becky. We think that we need coordinated action from the international community, and that is why the heads of 4 organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO and the WFP put out this call. Specifically, I think from the point of view of the WTO, first of all, we're saying that members should avoid putting export restrictions or prohibitions so that we can have the free flow of trade in the world. Because when there's a tendency to hold back food, you know, in a crisis, policymakers tend to hold back, and that will exacerbate the rising food prices. So allowing the free flow of trade is one. The second is those countries that have additional buffer stocks to release them on international markets so that prices can come down. We also need financing. Countries are suffering, not just from this food crisis. Remember, they haven't recovered from the pandemic. And then we have the fact that high inflation may lead central banks to tighten and raise interest rates, which will exacerbate the debt service problems of poor countries. So financially, they will be strapped. So we also need action. We need concessional financing grants to enable countries to purchase food.
I'm going to pull up a